Hi, everybody. This is Eve Harow on Rejuvenation for the Land of Israel Network. Today is November 12th, even though you're not going to be hearing this podcast for a couple of days. And the reason I start off saying that is because we're in the middle of a little rumble, I suppose you could call, with Gaza. We're not sure where this is going. So by the time you hear this, it could be that everything has once again died down and we're all back to whatever passes for normal in this country. And it could be that we're involved in something full-fledged and a little more serious. And it could be that on Friday, a tsunami will hit Gaza and wash all the terrorists out to sea. And we will be celebrating when you hear this podcast. Not having been given the gift of prophecy, I don't know what's going to be, but I just wanted to make sure that if any of these events happen, that you know that I didn't know about them when I was taping this podcast. So I'm very happy today. Because I'm in the middle of a terrific book called Palestine Posts. And what's even better about it is that I know the author. On June 14th, 1988, my husband and I, and our then 3 children, made Aliyah. And it turns out that another family made Aliyah on the same day, Daniel and Arlene Chertoff. And at their behest, every June 14th now, for the past couple of years, we've gone out for a celebratory dinner. It's possible that we were the only people that made Aliyah that day. I'm not sure. Anyhow, Daniel Chertoff, the last time we went out, told us that he was just finishing up a book. And so today I get to interview him as the author of that book. So first of all, Dan, thank you so much for joining me here on this beautiful Jerusalem day. At least the skies are clear here, no Iron Dome.
Thank you, Eve. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. Yeah, I think back to that day over 30 years ago when 100% of Olim all made Aliyah to fraught, and we've all come a long way since then.
We have. And we're still here.
We are still here. Well, you're still in Efrat, and I'm in Jerusalem, which is a good place for us. Yes. And a lot has happened since then.
That's right. Children and grandchildren and very, very full lives. So you were telling us what led to this book. So since I know, maybe tell the audience. This is not a book that you planned on writing. This is not something that was like kicking around a novel that you had in your mind for the last 30 years. So what is Palestine Posts?
No, you're absolutely right. My father was the foreign news editor and war correspondent for the Palestine Post during Israel's War of Independence and was also a soldier in the Hagana. So you can imagine that I grew up hearing these stories. We lived in America. I was born in the States. I grew up with my father's stories and also with the promise that eventually the family would move back to Israel, something that never happened. But I knew that I would have to make Aliyah. In fact, I think I'm one of the many people of my generation who was so inspired and so touched by the war, the 6-Day War, that I decided then, as a 14-year-old, that I would move to Israel. And I did, although I didn't get here till I was 34. And then my father remained in the States. But after his second wife died, I brought him to Israel. And he spent the last 6 years of his life in Israel, in Jerusalem, near me. And we had a wonderful 6 years together. During that time, he worked on his memoirs. And although I was kind of tired of hearing all of his stories, I helped him write the memoirs. I produced them, I edited them, and we published them just for the family. He never said anything to me about letters. I knew about articles because he had, after all, been an editor for the Post and I had seen his byline. But after he died, I started going through his papers and I came across a cache of about 400 letters. And the letters were incredible. Actually, when I started reading them, I thought, these are nice. I'll just scan them for my children. And if they're interested, they'll read them and, we'll see what happens. But as I started to read them, I realized that there were names that only I would understand, that only I would recognize. So I thought, okay, I'll edit, I'll annotate a little bit. And then gradually I got myself drawn in. There were names that I recognized. There were names that I didn't recognize. There were famous people. My father at one point writes to his parents saying, "Dear Mom and Dad, I'm sending you this Israeli singer. She's wonderful. I think she's going to be very successful. Her name is Shoshana Damari." Mm-hmm. And of course, she became an icon. So there were famous people as well, but who weren't famous at the time. As I was writing and identifying these people, one of my children asked me, "Okay, that's very nice, but what's the historical context? I don't fully understand." So before I knew it, I was not only annotating, but I was putting all of these events into context. And as I was doing it, I was also getting to know my father. My father was 25 years old. He was not only in Israel or in Palestine during a tumultuous time, but he also had an active social life. I was meeting his friends, and I was getting to know my father as a young man. So there were two strands that kept developing. One was the war, the events of the war, the political history also. And the second was my father's personal life. And those two strands wove themselves together and exploded for me into this book.
And I think make this a very unusual book, because if someone's writing a biography, yes, so they do put it in context and they write about the person's life, but it's from a more, let's say, objective point. But here you are writing about, you're zeroing in on your own father, but not the man that you knew, a man that existed before you were born. I also do want to mention, for those who are not aware, that the Palestine Post was the original name for what we now know today as the Jerusalem Post, which is the main English, at least in print, newspaper that we have here. And the reason that it was called the Palestine Post is because, well, pre-1948, the Jews were the Palestinians. So it was a Jewish-owned paper, and it was, you know, it wasn't like being run by the Mufti or anything like that. But that's why anything pre-48 will be Palestine Post?
Yeah, Eve, I have to tell you a funny story. Our last trip back from the United States, we were already sitting on the airplane when suddenly LL Security comes up to us and says, "Wait a second, we have a few more questions for you. What do you have to do with Palestine? What Arab countries have you been to? What's your connection with Arab Muslims?" And I was taken aback, like, what's all this about? Finally, the head of security shows me a photograph of my luggage tag, which has my business card with my website, PalestinePosts.com. So they thought I had some connection to Palestine. And when I tried to explain that the Jerusalem Post had formerly been called the Palestine Post, this person could not understand. And it took 10, 15 minutes of kind of anxious back and forth before she finally understood and relaxed.
So before there's an Israel in 1948, the Jews here are the Palestinians. And my own father, although it's a very different memory and experience that I have than you had. Maybe I'll talk about that later. He grew up in Jerusalem, and he's got Palestinian papers, because before there's an Israel, the Jews here were the Palestinians and the Arabs were the Arabs of southern Syria. So just thought that was an important point to make, because somebody may look at and you took maybe a little bit of a chance here. You were true to the job, meaning your father wrote for the Palestine Post and not for the Jerusalem Post. But somebody looking at the cover might say, like, what does this have to do with Israel? And actually maybe think the opposite, like the security guard on LL.
Exactly right, Eve. I intentionally selected an ambiguous title. Palestine Posts is a pun. It's the newspaper, the Palestine Post. It's dispatches, journalistic dispatches from Palestine, but it's also the letters that my father posted from Palestine. And he often writes about, my friends are the other Palestinians. And of course, the original name given to the area was given by the Romans, and it was intended as an insult to the Jews. When and how exactly the local Arabs adopted that name, I'm not sure about, but it clearly has changed definition. Mm-hmm.
And what's so marvelous, and you showed me the original, because many of the letters, of course, are in Hebrew, and you translated them. The book is in English, everybody, is that we have letters. So often now, and most of us write emails, which is just kind of a cold, the print that's going on. And just even to see the letters and the way that they're written and the handwriting, I have some like from my grandmother, that in itself is a throwback to a time that's not coming back, at least anytime soon, unless we all bomb ourselves back to the Stone Age, which is what they say the next war will be, right? We'll be doing that, but hopefully not.
That's a really good point. I think handling the letters that my father and his parents wrote, and I found also the correspondence between my grandparents from the mid-30s, was really a very emotional experience. I mean, when we actually touch artifacts it has an impact on us. But in the case of letters, it's all the more important because now we live in an era of very rapid communication where we expect responses to emails within a day and to text messages within minutes. And we also write carelessly because we know we can use word processing to fix what we really mean. In those days, people would sit down and spend the evening writing letters. They would have lovely paper, creamy paper with fountain pens, and they would have to sit and think deeply because there was no easy way to correct what they were writing. They had to think in paragraphs and in sections, and it's a whole different game. And I really mourn the days when people actually would think deeply about something rather than being so careless. So I worry about the quality of people's thinking nowadays because of what technology has allowed us to do. So I agree with you completely.
Right. It was even moving for me, and I'm not emotionally connected to see the letter that you just showed me. So who's he writing to? In addition to being a journalist and writing for the Post, which you intersperse within the book, you also mix it in with letters to his family, to his parents, to his brother and his sister, and you make it very clear that the letters are all different. He has a different relationship with each one of these people, and therefore each letter is giving a slightly different nuance of what he's experiencing here in Israel.
Right. This was a very important aspect of this project. I got to know my father's family. I really never knew my grandfather. He died when I was young, and he was demented the last few years. And it's incredible to me that my grandfather left Russia. He escaped from Tsarist Russia in 1900. He was already an Orthodox rabbi. He made it to the United States. He was a deeply committed Zionist. And at the same time, he was very culturally literate. So my father and his father actually wrote to each other only in Hebrew. And neither one could put together a sentence without a biblical or Talmudic allusion. And it was just mind-boggling to me how gorgeous their letters were. They were emotional, they were sensitive, they were perceptive, they were full of determination that the state of Israel would come into being. My grandfather was an ardent Zionist, which was not that widespread. America in the 40s American Jews were insecure. On the one hand, they were grateful to America to live there in a very free country. On the other hand, they were unsure, were Jews just a religion? Are we a nation? This is a debate that carries on till today. So I also had the opportunity to see the ambivalence of the American Jewish community during the 40s, of on the one hand being horrified at the slaughter of European Jewry, but at the same time being a little bit uncomfortable about the idea of a Jewish nation state. So my father and his father corresponded quite a bit about that. My father and his brother was a congregational rabbi in New Jersey. They spoke a lot about issues of mutual interest, and my father was often giving his brother material to discuss with his congregation. And then finally, my aunt was a social worker, a psychiatric social worker. She offered my father to be her long-distance shrink, and that's a role that he was happy to allow her to do. And he shared with her all of his personal stories. Mm-hmm. And wow, did I discover personal stories. In a nutshell, I discovered that my father proposed to a woman who turned him down. While he was waiting for her response, she was abroad. He was involved with someone else, and he had his eye on a third woman. Now, all three of these women turned out to be very important in this story. And two of them remained in Israel. And I found all of them. The one he proposed to is still alive, and I was able to speak with her. The other two women are gone, but I've become very good friends with their children. So the correspondence was a real eye-opener to not only the history and my father as a young man, but also was relevant to a lot of other people.
Because the man, and you talk about this very openly in the book, it's actually quite raw. emotionally, and it couldn't have been so easy for you to do that either, to kind of put yourself out there on the page. But the father that you knew is very different than the man that appears in these letters and in the book.
Yeah, that's really true. To be blunt, my father was not very successful after he returned to the United States in 1951. I think he was putting off, my father was a rabbi, and I think he was putting off becoming a congregational rabbi for as long as he could. And it's unfortunate that he walked away from a relatively successful career in journalism and writing in order to go into a profession that he felt was inevitable.
Do you know why he did that?
I really don't. You know, his father tried to dissuade him from being a rabbi. He said, it's a wonderful education, it's a good thing to do as a fallback, but it's not the right path for you. You should be a journalist, you should be writing. What my grandfather wanted for my father was for my father to enter the pantheon of Hebrew letters. And my grandfather loved reading about my father meeting the great literati in Palestine in 47 and in 48. And I think he was a little disappointed by my father's decision to go into the rabbinate. And it just didn't suit my father. While he was a good writer, he was not a good pastor. Mm-hmm. So he really wasn't that successful in it. And it's unfortunate.
But did you have a chance to ever ask him? These letters come to light after your father's gone. I can't imagine how frustrating it must have been for you sometimes to read some of these letters and say, you know, but Dad or Abba or whatever you called your father, like, why? What happened here? And he's no longer around to answer the question. And having said this already, it must have been intentional on his part. He could have given you the letters while he was still alive.
Wow, Eve, that's really a big question. In my heart of hearts, I think he forgot. I think he forgot about the letters. Really? When we were doing his memoirs, he showed me some articles and some photographs and some of his documents, like his press cards, his press pass, and things like that, which I treasure, and the pins from when he was in the army. But he showed me so many documents that I figured that was it. Mm-hmm. And it was only after he died that I found letters. I really think that he forgot them, but I love to fantasize that it was intentional, that he left them for me to find, and specifically to embark on the journey without his help, because it took so much effort to identify some of the people that he mentions, and then to track them down and to really get to meet them. And I'm going to tell you a lovely story. His friend Anne Strauss is all over the book. It's a family that his sister actually met in Ohio. And he said, they have a daughter who is in Palestine. Mordecai, you should meet her and you should date her. It's a wonderful family and I'm sure she's beautiful. And my father did meet her. And she had a boyfriend at the time. She worked for Yaski. Chaim Yaski was the head of Hadassah Hospital.
Who's later killed in the convoy.
We'll come to that, right. So my father finds Anne. They hit it off as friends. And she has a boyfriend named Alter Rechnitz. One day she goes to pick him up on his kibbutz, Malei HaChamisha, and they get onto a convoy going up to Jerusalem. The convoy is attacked. Alter pushes her off of her perch, spreads himself on top of her, and absorbs all the bullets, saving her life and dying in the process. After a lot of research, I discovered that Anne later married a man named Israel Shankar. They had a son, Roi. Took me a while to find Roi. We finally met, and I said, Roi, tell me all about the attack. And he said, well, I know that it happened, but she would never talk about it, so I don't know anything. So I said, well, you know, my father wrote a beautiful story that interweaves what exactly happened on the attack, during the attack, and their relationship, the complications of their relationship. Would you like to hear it? And we sat in a cafe in Tel Aviv together, me reading the story, and the two of us sitting there and crying. Wow. So what I thought was really just stories of personal interest, stories that are important to my family and to my children turned out to be important to the next generation as well. And whereas I had hoped that they would fill in information for me, I turned out to have more information, and what I was able to tell them was critically important for them.
Wow. That's not what you set out to do. That's what happened.
It isn't what I set out to do at all. And what it taught me, with Yossi Klein Halevi's help, is that our stories are not ours alone. They really belong to the entire Jewish people. I filled in information for Roi, but I also supplemented what is known about this attack. There was very little information about the attack. I read the accounts both in the Palestine Post and also in the New York Times. And of course, like the New York Times, there's only a passing reference to it within a story headlined something about, an attack by the Zionists in response to something.
It's good to know that something's never changed. The New York Times isn't pro-Israel and apparently never was.
Yeah. The New York Times put it into their context, and it is unfortunate, and you're absolutely right that nothing has changed. But I'm going to tell you one other story that is incredible to me. My father wrote to his parents saying, "I know that you read my article describing the bombing of the Palestine Post, but now let me tell you what really happened in detail." He was in the building, and he wrote this 4,500-page detailed description of the bombing of the Palestine Post. And the part for me that is the most poignant is when he did 4,500 word detailed description. My father describes how his favorite linotype operator, Robbie, was badly hurt. And my father dragged him out and then describes how he was worried about Robbie's condition. Would he survive? Would he be blind? I knew his 3 beautiful children. I would see them together in Rehavia, and I'm really praying that he's okay. Well, Robbie was not okay. I mean, he did succumb to his injuries sometime later. And a friend of ours put me together with the youngest of Robbie's children. His name is David Nevo, and David is 72, and he never knew his father. He was just a little boy when his father was killed. And this is a huge hole in his life and in his knowledge. And although David has been a very successful high-tech and technology executive in Israel, he remains focused on this episode. And all of a sudden, a stranger comes along with a detailed eyewitness account written by someone who loved his father and who actually dragged him out of the building and may have bought him some extra time. So you can imagine that sitting with David was a very powerful experience for me. And I'm thrilled that I was able to fill in some of the gaps in our mutual history. So again, I can't stress enough that although my book is a history of the War of Independence, it's from a very personal angle. And all of the people who had roles in it, even in this next generation, continue to have, a real stake in it.
So I'm going to guess that this isn't over either, that once the book comes out, there'll be people who read the book and say, that was my grandmother, or that was my parents' neighbor, or you're going to continue to get stories even after this has come out, because now there's a much wider audience than the people that you found in your father's letters.
Oh, I really hope that happens. I mean, I think my book ends with the plea that anybody who recognizes anyone, please be in touch. There are a lot of interesting connections, and there are people I haven't gotten to yet. I'll give you a lovely example. My father wrote a beautiful article about one of the Palmach's operations. Now, you remember, of course, the Palmach was the shock troops, the commandos, the strike force, exactly. So he wrote this lovely article, and the Palmach then adopted him. And this is how he became a war correspondent. At the same time, his counterpart at Haaretz was a man named Azaria Rappaport, who was a wonderful reporter, very talented guy. And my father and Azariah became Azariah Mordecai. Mm-hmm. We are the Palmach's people. And I started to trace Azariah's family a little bit, and it turns out his daughter is Talia Lipkin-Shachak, who was married to a great Ramatkal who unfortunately died young, right? The chief of the general staff. And so
she herself is a journalist. She has a radio show. She's very well known in Israel.
She is a highly respected journalist. And although we've spoken, we haven't had the opportunity yet to meet. And her mother is still alive. I'm hoping to get to meet her. And there are several other people from that time period who are still alive. My father writes a lot about a friend of his who was in Palestine at the same time, who became a medic. She published her own letters, and she publishes a beautiful description of spending a lovely evening with friends at Mordecai's house where they were listening to records and they made Shabbat together. And my father describes the same evening in almost the same words in the letters to his family. So there are a lot of people from that time period that I'm still hoping to be able to speak with.
So your father is born into a religious family, and as you said, his letters, especially to his own father, are just peppered with Talmudic references and biblical quotes, which necessitated you having quite a few footnotes on each page to make sure that your readers would understand what exactly that reference was. And you did an excellent job, I have to say, on that, because not everybody would know something, maybe Jews might know it, but not even all Jews. And you helped put it into context, like why he would use that particular phrase in his letter. He wasn't showing off because he didn't think anyone was ever going to read it. I mean, you're getting a peek into an intimate correspondence that was never intended to be put in a book.
I found, in order to deal with my grandfather's letters, I had to really look for someone who not only could translate them from the Hebrew into English, but could identify the references. And the person who did that, I'm going to give her a shout out, is Shira Koppel in fraught. She is a brilliant, brilliant woman who did a beautiful job translating and identified the references.
She herself comes from a rabbinic family as well.
Right. So, for example, one of the most beautiful letters in the book is the description of the reaction in Jerusalem to the UN vote to partition. And Eve, you and I talked about that letter. The letter was written, it's 4 pages in Hebrew, probably written in one sitting. And it starts out, Vayihi b'chatzi halayla, and it came to pass at midnight. And this is a reference, of course, to the Haggadah for Pesach, and it is intended to be a reference to the salvation of the Jews as they left Egypt, and then he continues, Ve'avo leTzion Goel, a redeemer has come to Israel. So these were the only ways that my father could express the emotion of what he was feeling. And as you said, he didn't write this for publication. He wrote it to his family. In fact, his family was so overwhelmed by the letter that my uncle then... Should we acknowledge that a jet is flying overhead?
Well, if we're still here doing the interview, then it's on its way to somewhere else.
We should note that jets don't usually fly over Jerusalem.
And we should wish it Godspeed wherever it's going.
Amen. In the end, my uncle translated the letter from the Hebrew into English, and it actually was read in many synagogues in America, and it got some readership. But I love the fact that there are many references within the letter to Passover, because in fact, Passover is when the Jews became a people. And the partition vote is when we were once again given the opportunity to reconstitute the modern site. So the book actually has many, many comparisons, allusions to Pesach, and Pesach is a leitmotif for the whole book.
I've always been fascinated by the terminology Kaftet b'November, because when you speak about the partition plan, that's the vote that the UN takes on the 29th of November 1947 to partition Palestine. The Arabs don't accept it, the Jews do. We've got a 6-month internal war, and then after Ben Gurion declares the state on May 14th, 1948, we've got an all-out war and being attacked by the countries around us. And we could even say, especially given the fact that we just heard the jet, that that war is still ongoing, the war for Israel's existence. It's the only date that I know of, please correct me if I'm wrong, where it's a mix of Hebrew and English. You know, we'll have, let's say, our Jewish holidays. So Yom Kippur is not going to be on your September-October map. It roams all over because it's a Jewish date. It's the 10th of Tishrei. But Kaf Tet is 29. Every Hebrew letter, it corresponds to a number. We call that gematria. Kaf is 20, Tet is 9. So 29th of November is a very unusual way of saying a date. Is that the only, you've done a lot of research on a lot of things. Is that the only instance that you have of a mix like that? And do you think that imbued in that is some of what comes out of your father's letter, a feeling that this isn't just a vote that's taken by human beings about partitioning Palestine, but it's something being perhaps orchestrated from above, something that fits into Jewish history, a redemption of sorts, and that idea was also put into a secular date?
It's a wonderful question. I think you're right. I think it is the only date of an important event in the Israeli and Jewish calendar that is loazit. You know, it's the Christian calendar, because of course the date for Israel independence is the 14th of May, but we look at it on the Jewish calendar, you know, of ER, and I think. I just came up with this now as you were asking the question. It could be that the UN vote is, of course, an event that occurred in the secular world. It happens at the United Nations, and it is something that we had to passively wait for the non-Jewish world to implement. The Declaration of Independence was proactive. It was our decision. We did it. We made it on that date. So it could be, and I'm just speculating, and your question caused me to think this up just now. I may be right, I may be wrong, but when we are the actors, then we use the Jewish calendar. When we are the passive recipients, even if we have a huge stake, I think we look at it according to the non-Jewish calendar, and that's probably true, for example, for the 6-Day War. You know, it's always June 6th. Of course, the Yom Kippur War, we always think of as Yom Kippur. But I think maybe that's one way to think of it.
Mm-hmm. Because it really does stand alone, I think, in all the events that have happened to us. But since we're talking about your father's letter to his grandfather, one of the interesting, more personal aspects of the book is you get to know your grandfather, and you find how similar you are to him.
That was maybe the biggest revelation for me. I didn't know my grandfather well. When I was little, he was a very old man, and people seemed to fuss over him. He seemed very fragile, and they were all incredibly respectful and loving of him. And now I understand much better why. My grandfather was an unbelievably loving man. He was so devoted to his family, and he was so empathetic and perceptive. His letters are gorgeous. I mean, he's obsessed with the development, the emotional and intellectual health of every member of his family. The correspondence between my grandparents from the 1930s, when my grandmother was in Palestine with my father and his siblings, and her husband remained at home, is stunning, because she writes to him about how you made me who I am. You know, I grew up with parents who didn't believe that girls should have an education, but you believed I should. And my grandmother got her master's degree at 66, at a time when that was absolutely not done. So my grandfather was very, very nurturing, and he was very good at listening. At the same time, he was a bit of a hypochondriac, and He was overly sensitive, and I think in many ways I'm just like him. And I think that if we had known each other better, I think we would have adored each other. And the reason this is important to me is because I'm very involved with my grandchildren. And I adore each of my grandchildren. I spend a huge amount of time with them. And I think it may be a generational thing, but I feel like I missed out. And I feel like if he had known me, and if he had been young enough for me to know him, I think we would have had a great relationship.
So I can see that on the one hand, it would make you sad. Now that you know what you missed. Whereas most of us don't know what we missed. Wow, another jet. Cool. Most of us don't know what we missed because we don't have letters like this. So we can only have conjecture, or we can remember, if our grandparents were alive, the little old person, very, very different from what they were like in midlife and vigorous, like our age. Would we be friends with our grandparents if they were our contemporaries? What would we have in common? There's the old joke, of course, that grandparents and grandchildren have the common enemy, right? Which is that middle generation.
I couldn't agree more. Having these letters, correspondence between my grandparents, is an absolute treasure. Watching some of the interactions between them, or reading the interactions between them, my grandfather describes the boat pulling away in 1935 when my grandmother took my father and his siblings. It is one of the most beautiful lyrical pieces I've ever heard. You were gorgeous standing on the deck as the boat and the light, and like, oh my God, my grandfather was so poetic and romantic. Right. So it is a wonderful thing to be able to experience that directly. And I think my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren will have the opportunity to have that direct contact with their great-great-grandfather who had escaped from Tsarist Russia. It's amazing to me.
So the letters that he has with his brother and sister, I assume they had children, and you have cousins. Were you able to illuminate an aspect of their parents' life, meaning your aunt and uncle, that they didn't know? Like, did they come to some realizations as you did through the correspondence about your father, about their parents? And if I may add to that, was it hard for them? Like, not everything we find out about things that have happened in the past are pleasant or easy to realize.
I don't know the answer to that. I did share the correspondence with them. I also interviewed both of them. I have only one cousin from each. I offered to give them their parents' letters or scans of them because I'm not parting with anything. I know that my cousin Adam, whose mother Naomi was those letters between my father and his sister were extremely intimate. I know that the letters were very important to him. I don't know if he learned anything about his mother from them. So I don't know the answer.
Mm-hmm. Because the treasure is not just for you. I mean, there's the other side of the letters and the people who were writing the letters back, which you also have. You don't just have your father's side. You have the letters he received from his family members.
No, I will make all of the letters available to everybody in my family. Mm-hmm. My father received a dozen letters from one of the important women in his life, and I've sent those letters to her daughter. Her daughter and I have become extremely close. She's become a dear, dear friend, and we see each other a couple of times a year. We make it our business to see one another. So I do want everyone to have those primary sources. What they decide to do with them, how they decide to analyze them or think about them, it depends on their own needs.
Mm-hmm. You speak kind of briefly, at least as far in the book as I've gotten. Your father comes here as he even gets his rabbinical ordination after he's here. He finishes it while he's here. Yet religiously, you think he slipped a little bit, like he wasn't, as observant when he was here. He made some references, maybe to doing something on Shabbat that he might not have done in the States. And you can only imagine reading between the lines, given that he's writing to a religious family, that maybe there were things he didn't want them to know. Do you understand that? Like living in Israel now yourself, and, I'm speaking also from a very personal place. we're living in a Jewish country. Sometimes people, don't cross all their T's and dot all their I's as they might have in the diaspora. You think that was what was happening with your father? You don't really know.
That is a hugely important question, and it's a big, big topic. I think there were many, many things going on. First of all, my father was at war. And as soon as you're at war, then certain strictures go out the window. At the same time, the Rabbanut, the chief rabbis in Israel at the time, were Zionist.
Unlike today, unfortunately, for the most part.
Exactly. So they put the war effort first and really understood that there was a need to compromise on some activities. Secondly, my father was a conservative rabbi, even though he had an extremely strong religious background and went to yeshiva. He had a strictly Orthodox upbringing, but he was a conservative rabbi. And his father was an Orthodox rabbi who also had conservative ordination and advanced degrees from Columbia University in philosophy on non-Jewish subjects. So they were highly enlightened. But I think your question really touches on a huge issue that has a big impact on diaspora-Israel relations. And that is that when Jews are outside of Israel, how do they express their Jewishness? And one of the easiest ways to do it is through religious observance. But once we're in Israel, I think maybe the national aspects are important to us. And the minutiae of religious law may perhaps recede a bit. And I think all of us, I think you and I and my friends, we're always thinking in our heads, what is the relationship between our religious observance and our national, our feelings of being a nation? And I think this is part of the dilemma now. It's part of what separates Jews, American Jews and Israeli Jews. And it's something we really need to try to understand better.
And in the book, one of the few times that your father and his family do not see eye to eye and are upset with each other has to do with, and I forget the exact context, where he gets upset, your father, from here in Israel, from some of the reaction of American Jews to one of the events that happens here. There's a leader. Is it Weiss? I don't remember.
Yes,
Stephen Weiss, who does something that upsets a lot of the people here in Israel. Yet your father took it further and got upset with American Jews. And I think that could have been a headline even written today. Where the Jewish leadership in America is does that necessarily mean that American Jews follow? And his family in America is they don't really understand where he's coming from here, why he's suddenly upset with American Jewry. He's kind of placing himself on this side of the pond. You can see kind of his Israeliness, if you will, coming out, because he's living here. And this is something that, of course, only deepens as the decades go on. And your father kind of was right there. And that few exchange of letters really shines a light on something that is a big issue even today.
Exactly. The Reform movement made a statement. They published what they called the Pittsburgh Platform, which was in the 19th century, and I'm blanking on the date. And they were very clear that in their view, the Jews were a religion and not a nation. And Stephen Wise and other Jewish leaders in the middle of the 20th century continued to believe that the Jews should not push for nationhood, that the Jews should be absorbed in America and religion was a personal matter, an individual matter, and that there was no national expression of that. So they were ambivalent. At the same time, the Orthodox movement, it wasn't actually until the 50s that they began to have more of a Zionist orientation. So American Jewry, absolutely, and there's some interesting histories of this. American Jewry in the 40s was very, very ambivalent about it. They were very much split. On the one hand, they didn't want the Jews to undermine their position in America, but at the same time, they were aghast that the Jews were not being admitted anywhere, that there was no place for Jews to go. There were 250,000 Jews wandering around Europe, looking for refuge after World War II, and no place would take them. Israel was the only place that would take them. And at the same time, don't forget, the Arab countries threw out 960,000 Jews. Where were they supposed to go? Israel was the only place. And in fact, Danny Gordis just wrote a book about this. Divided We Stand, I think, is the name of the book. I don't remember, but it's an important book, and it describes the whole heritage to this exact question.
Mm-hmm. And I think that we see that today. I just finished guiding a wonderful group of American women, Jewish women, coming here to Momentum, which I do a few times a year. And it's not a dual loyalty. I would prefer to call it maybe a dual love. Okay, at the one hand, coming to Israel, feeling at home here in a way that you really can't feel anywhere else, because the majority of the people here are Jewish. The signs are in Hebrew, the food, it's just a very Jewish country, yet feeling very American, very much at home there. And I know that you and I, to a certain degree, have to a lesser degree because we made the choice to make our homes here. But when I go back to the United States, I flow right into it. It's easy. Culturally, it's where I am in terms of, and I love the United States. So it's something that for a long time, the Jews didn't experience, because we had one home and that was begrudging wherever we were in the Pale of Settlement or wherever, till we got thrown out the next time. And now it's almost a double blessing to a certain degree, that there can be a few countries in which we feel at home. Do we have to make a choice? Can we love both? Can we feel loyal to both? But what your father is writing is before that, when Israel is seen as more of a refuge than a home, just like somewhere to take them in. Now we have a different situation where Israel is drawing people in, not just because they have no place to go, but because it's an exciting, vibrant country on the move that I know you and I can't imagine living anywhere else.
Absolutely. I love America as well, and I love going back. But truthfully, after 32 years, America is not home anymore. And I'm amused by America, and I appreciate America, but it is absolutely not home. At the same time, I think the situation for Jews in America is very different than what it is, for example, in Europe. I have a lot of family in Paris and also in England. My daughter just spent 4 years living in England, so we really got to know the situation there. And it's really hard to believe that we seem to be in a place that's similar to Europe in the 30s. It's really hard to understand. And for European Jews, of which there are close to 1 million, Israel actually is a very important potential refuge. And the number of French Jews, for example, who have second homes here, they say bluntly, we're hedging. Mm-hmm. It's impossible to believe that after the Holocaust and after the development of democracies in Europe, that we're in a place where Jews are still persecuted in Europe. Now, the excuse is that this is a result of Israel's behavior. And of course, that's ridiculous. I mean, it's completely unacceptable. So I think it remains important that Jews worldwide feel that there is a place. I think it's unlikely that Americans will be made to feel so uncomfortable. Although, if you look at the recent wave of synagogue shootings and other anti-Semitic attacks, there's no question it's on the rise.
One of the women who was with me this week, and this is something I wouldn't have known unless she had told me, her son's school was shut down and the kids were sent home because there was a bomb threat. And they said this happens regularly in schools in America. So things are definitely heating up.
You know, the first time I took my children to Europe, and we would go to a shul on Shabbat, the shul was guarded. It had guards with automatic weapons. This was a long time ago. And I could not, I had this overwhelming feeling like, why is that okay? Why should it be that only Jews require their houses of worship to be guarded? Now, unfortunately, other houses of worship also have to be guarded. But it is unbelievable to me that we are basically addressing the symptom and not going to the root. And I don't know how anti-Semitism ultimately can be rooted out. It's something that continues to change and evolve. Of course, in the Middle Ages, Jews were hated because they were killers of Christ, because of the Christianity thing. You know, in the early 20th century, Jews were hated because they were communists. Then they were hated because they're capitalists. Then we're hated because we're colonialists. Whatever is the current hatred, That's what the Jews are guilty of. No, that is a clear sign that this is an excuse for hatred. Right. It's not valid.
It's not. And as we hear the jets flying above, so we're still protecting ourselves from, you want to call it religious / territorial / whatever it is. And that's what Israel has to deal with here in the Middle East.
Eve, there's one thing we haven't talked about that I want to be sure to mention, and that is that I really had to give myself a crash course in the War of Independence in order to write this book. And it was very important to me to read other descriptions from people who were less sympathetic. So, for example, I read the memoirs of General John Baygot Glubb, who was the British commander of the Jordanian Legion. I read the memoirs of Count Folke Bernadotte, who was the UN mediator charged with actually implementing partition. I read many, many descriptions because I was trying to also come to grips with the early history of Israel and how it might be relevant to the current conflict. And it was important to me to write the book in a way that is objective and non-polemic. I'm not a right-winger, I'm not a left-winger. I wanted to just provide a description of events as told through my father's eyes. Obviously, he was an individual who had his own prejudices, and he was not very politically correct and all. But still, it was important to me that the context be as neutral as possible. And I just want to say that one of the things that really struck me was in the UN mediator's memoirs, he describes his frustration with his inability to forge any kind of agreement. And one of the things that he records 4 times is how the Egyptian foreign minister came to him and said, "You have to understand, we don't care if there's a Palestinian state, a state for another Arab state. We don't care. But for us, it is a matter of life and death that there not be a Jewish state." And this is something that he repeats. And this is something that comes out in the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine's report, which, by the way, I think is brilliant. I think they did an amazing job analyzing the situation and writing a report. And the fact of the matter is, I think that view persists till today. And although, once again, I don't view myself as right or left, but really dead center, I remain concerned that that aspect has never changed, that there still is not a meeting of the minds, that 2 different nations can share this area and that each will respect the other. And I think until that happens, I think we're doomed to just muddling along.
Well, it's not about anything we've done. It's about who we are. But if it makes you feel any better, they also won't accept Christians in their midst or Yazidis in their midst or anybody who isn't whatever particular brand of Islam is running that particular country, Sunni, Shia, or what have you. So I don't take it too personally on that level here in the Middle East. But we've carved out a space for ourselves. We're protecting it with everything we've got. God's in there too, for those of us who believe that. And most of us do, and I know you and I do. And it's definitely not boring. But I really want to thank you because I think that you added an important component, not just on the historical level of what's going on here in the 40s, but because you really shared a piece of your family in here, which not everybody would do. You know, while reading the book, I thought to myself, you could have easily just passed this on to your kids, made a little family memoir, and not gone public with it. I mean, you're not doing it for the fame and fortune. Thank God you're just fine on your own. But there's a piece, as you said, our history is there's a national history as well. Our histories are not just our own. It's a part of a very big and beautiful mosaic of the Jewish people. And your father's little part of it, which would have been lost had you not published this book, has now become a part of the history books in that sense. And I think for many people who are not as involved with Israel, not knowledgeable about the War of Independence, this will be a very quick primer, a quick jump, quick and easy and pleasant. It's not a heavy historical, book with full of dates and events and battles. But it's a personal memoir interspersed with historical facts. And I think that it's a great addition to a time period that will be written about for a long time. And so I would just want to thank you for writing the book. And I would like you to be able to tell my listeners where they can get a hold of it for themselves.
Thank you, Eve. Yes, I can't repeat often enough that I believe that Jewish history is deeply personal. It's not some objective thing that happened to other people. It happened to us. And when we have an opportunity to share those stories, especially when they're integrated into our family stories, it's a wonderful opportunity. The book is available on Amazon. Again, it's called Palestine Posts, an Eyewitness Account of the Birth of Israel. It's available both in paperback and also as a Kindle. It's available in Israel at Pomerantz Books and some other bookstores. It's not yet in Stymatsky's. I hope it will be. And it's available also from Koren Press.
Okay. And if anybody listening to this wants to be in touch with you, do you have a website, an address that you can give out?
Yes, I have a website. It's PalestinePosts.com. And you are more than welcome to be in touch, to leave a message, and I will respond immediately. As you can see also, I'm really happy to be talking about this time period and about this project. And if you would like me to come, I would be happy to speak to various groups or whomever and to share the story.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this is a great opportunity for a book club somewhere to read the book, to invite Danny in to speak about it, really from a very personal perspective. And maybe he'll even share some things that aren't in the book. I don't know.
I would be happy to. And I want to say again, just what a pleasure this is to have this conversation with you, Eve, considering we started our Israel Odyssey together. And it's amazing that here we are over 30 years later. Our children are here. We have grandchildren here. And we've watched Israel evolve from a really more fragile state to a really incredible place to live that is doing so much to make contributions in so many different ways all over the world. And I just hope we'll be able to continue to do that.
And with this book, you've made your contribution. So thank you, among others. So thank you so much, Daniel Chertoff, author of Palestine Posts. I highly recommend it. And hopefully I'll see you before June 14th when we have our annual dinner celebrating, which for both of us is
32.
What it'll be 33. No? 2020? 32, 1988. What a ride. And it's not nearly over yet. So thank you again.
Thank you very much, Eve.
Okay. Eve Harow, Rejuvenation on the Land of Israel Network. Thanks to Tabitha. Thanks to Ben. You can always write to me, Eve at thelandofisrael.com. Love getting your feedback. Take care, everybody. Praying for things to be quiet and everybody we love to be safe. It's Eve Harow. Take care. Goodbye for now.
The question is, why are the Jews there in the first place? The Jewish people have been yearning to return to their ancient homeland for a long time.
The Yishai Fleischer Show, the voice of a new generation of pro-Israel activists.
And there's only two kinds of minorities in the Middle East, armed or unarmed.
Inspiring minds to think differently.
That jihadism doesn't just attack Jews. It attacks Christians, and it mostly attacks Muslims.
Inspiration, spirituality, and politics.
So first and foremost, this country is here to defend Jewish people and to live in its ancestral homeland.
Listen to the Yishai Fleischer Show every week on the Land.